Well, of course, I don't know at all what this will be about because we haven't met before. And I was a bit surprised by the topic of the debate, which initially I thought will be a bit different. But nevertheless, this is a very important subject, and nowadays you can see lots of discussion going on in the, well, media of all sorts on these topics. So what will that be about? I try to follow the title somehow, and so I have the 3 points first, and then I'll try to wrap it up a bit. The first point is, does God help us to understand the universe? And the second is, does God help us to understand life? And then, does God help us to understand mind? So my point today will be trying to tell you that I'm pretty happy with the way science explains things. And I'm quite sure that we are going to learn more and more. But also I try to understand, why do we believe in anything? What's the cognitive mechanism behind our beliefs and convictions? Why some people find some arguments compelling and some people reject them? That's the, well, thing related to how brains are learning. So first thing is, well, as you know, every culture has some ideas about how the universe has originated. That's one of the points that people bring up frequently, saying that, well, we cannot understand the origin of the universe. And all pre-scientific ideas about astronomy, physics, life, and mind that we can read about prove to be completely wrong. Aristotle was quite wrong in the way he understood the motion, or rather how he thought that the momentum is going to be depleted and things are going straight and then going down somehow. The world picture that the ancient people had was very primitive. There was no reason, actually, for them to discover how the universe looks like. Astrophysics gave us a completely different picture of the world. The world appears to be very beautiful, but also incredibly complex. We know how to calculate the movements. The radio telescope that we're going to build will allow you to trace objects 1 billion kilometers from the Earth with the accuracy of 1 kilometer. We have incredible precision of how we look at the universe, and we ask specific questions. What type of stars do we have? Galaxies, extrasolar planets, interstellar medium, distribution of cosmic microwave background radiation, etc. We know that the carbon in us and all the elements in us are because there are supernovas that will explode and throw the heavy elements into space. And from these heavy elements, the planets are formed. So, as it was a fashionable saying in the 60s, we are stardust. And that's something that the ancient people could not dream about. This complexity of the universe and the size of the universe was something that Copernicus could not believe in, of course. That was one of the reasons that he never wanted to publish his work, because it seems that the universe is not a human size. Well, he thought, his reasoning was that the universe must be spherical, because of all forms, this is the most perfect, well, shape. And so he thought that the Earth must move because the immobility is more noble than the movement, and therefore heavens that are divine have to be immobile, while the Earth has to move because the Earth is in the sublunar area and it's chaotic. And that's the type of reasoning that people had still in 15th, 16th century that has nothing to do with the science that we have today. The universe appeared to be big, empty and cold. They could not measure the difference in the angles, and so they came out with the conclusion at the time, the early astronomers, that the universe is very big. But that was not something that we could accept. The terrible vision that the universe is big, cold, and has billions of planets, and we are just one of the solar systems among these billions, and that the Earth is just a tiny, well, one place in the universe, was a terrible vision that people in medieval ages could not accept. And then comes Newton, and he is the first who is able to calculate how the planets move. And he discovers the laws of motion, but of course he sees that the laws of motions, well, when you look at the solar system, cannot be responsible for the stability of the solar system because there are comets, there are the interaction between the planets. So he thinks that God is necessary. God is necessary to correct the system. And the solar system is unstable, he thinks, and so occasionally divine intervention is required. So he thinks that God is necessary in the picture of his worldview. But then, as you know, here comes Laplace, who wrote 5 volumes of the Celestial Mechanics. He started to write it in 1799, ended in 1825. And there is a famous, although not quite correct, encounter with Napoleon. When Napoleon was quite interested in science. So he heard about the work of Laplace, and he said, well, what part does God play in your picture of the universe? And Laplace famously said, I have no need for this hypothesis. That's not quite correct, because what he meant is that he really doesn't need God to correct the system. But he still believed that God has put that into motion somehow. But this divine clockmaker that is correcting and winding up the system was not necessary already at that time. Okay, so now some people think that, again, we need God because several people have been talking about anthropic principle. Brandon Carter is an astrophysicist, and in 1973 we had a big celebration in Torun because of 500th birthday of Copernicus. I just entered the university at that time, and there was a big conference also in Krakow, and Carter has stated the anthropic principle. He said that there are 2 versions, basically. Why are we here? Well, if we are here, that means the universe must have the properties that allow the life to develop. And so he said, there is an anthropic selection of privileged space-time location in the universe. The previous version was Copernican, we are not in the privileged place. But now we think that this is a bit privileged place. And then he said that there is a strong version of it, which will address the values of fundamental constants of physics, that if you change them a bit, then you find that, for example, the stars will not form, the galaxies will not form. If the gravitation is too strong, we'll just have black holes. And so there is a subtle interplay between the values of gravitational constant, the fine structure constant, which measures some electromagnetic forces, and nuclear reaction and other things. And people thought that this is so fine that you cannot change them even a bit, because the whole thing will collapse. If the strong forces are not strong enough or are too weak, then the carbon will not form in the stars. If the carbon will not form, there will be no life, etc. So that seemed to be a big problem, but some years later, some people like Fred Adams, for example, have shown in their work that you can change all these parameters together, and that approximately 25% of all the space of the parameters will allow the stars to exist. And so they're like patches of, well, values of fundamental constants in which the universe may develop life and the stars, and it will be, well, good for life somehow. But the anthropic principle is a very interesting thing. When I had my habilitation defense, which was in '87, actually I gave a talk. You have to give the rehabilitation a special lecture. And I gave a lecture on anthropic principle. And that's because I've read the book by Tipler and Barrow, and Tipler has a wife from Torun, actually. He's been visiting here. I've met him first time in the Astrophysics Institute in Munich. Well, anyway, this is trying to find gaps in science and saying, okay, I have God, and God is explaining that. And that's very bad, and some theologians understand it quite well. One of them is Professor Michał Heller, who is a priest, but also he is, well, a famous cosmologist. He knows about the origins of the universe. He's got Templeton Prize in 2008, as you know, and he started the Copernican Center in Krakow. And in a book that just has been published recently, which is called God and Science, he explains that we should not invoke God as an explanation of things that we do not yet understand. And his point is very clear. When you look at the history, people have done it many times, and every time they've done it, they failed, because science has progressed, and science has explained things that people thought cannot be explained. And so, in his view, science will lead to knowledge, but religion will give meaning to our life somehow, and this is a very different thing. So he tries to separate these two things. Okay, so I'm going to leave the universe and the origin of life, and move now to the origin of the universe, and move now to the understanding of life. Now, again, some people believed until 1950, most people believed that there is some special thing about the living matter, that you cannot really make life out of that matter, that there is some, elan vital, the life force that moves things. And first time chemists have synthesized the organic substance, they've been very surprised that you can synthesize that. Now you know that there are people who are talking about the artificial life. They're talking about really putting things together and creating different life forms from the beginning, from that matter, really. And this is something that is going to happen very soon. Good or bad, that's another thing. But unfortunately, this is how far we've got in this game. And there is one fellow who has been very famous in this area, and that's Francis Collins. He is a physician, but also became an expert in genetics. And he was running, actually, the Human Genome Project, which you remember for 7 years, actually, they've been trying to make a map or find the genes in human genome. And then he's been the director of the National Institute of Health in Bethesda in Maryland, very important place for science. He has written several books. Many of them are also in Polish. And in these books, The Language of God, for example, he talks about scientists presenting evidence for belief. And he describes how he converted to Christianity. A very interesting process again. And I think this is quite a deep book because he looks at the evolutionary creation, or as he calls it, the theistic evolution. He calls it biologs, the universe that is tuned for life. So in his view, the universe is somehow tuned for life. And of course, Copernicus and other people have been scared by the fact that this is a big, cold, non-human universe, nothing like that they had before. Collins argues that basically intelligent design and creationism are all wrong, and he gives several examples showing how people said, okay, this cannot be explained, and that very soon experts in biology have explained that. He quotes, for example, Michael Bette's book, Darwin's Black Box, which was written in 1996. And he writes about, in this book, he writes about several things. One of them is the bacterium flagellum. This is what we see here. Oh, sorry. This is not the button. This is what you see here. You have all kinds of hairs, not only in the ears, but also in the eyes and many organs in the body. And they are composed from about 30 proteins in very complex manner. And it's really kind of a nanomachine. It has a structure that cannot really arise in random way. That's clear, and that nobody who understands evolution talks about random, emergence of things. That's a very wrong concept, but people don't understand what they criticize, and so they came up with all kinds of criticism in here. In this case, this is a 30 protein that have to combine in a special way to create this nanomachine, and that is something that people couldn't understand, but once the problem was brought up, very quickly, biologists have explained that, and Miller, in this article that I quoted here, The Flagellum Unspun, in the book that was published in 2004, has explained how that happened in evolution and why the structure is such. And there is no mystery in this. And I'm not going to tell you about the details of molecular biology, because that requires first a course in molecular biology. All these things are very complex, and people don't understand the complexity of evolution. And for that reason, it's very hard to discuss that in public, right? So one can ask, is the universe for life, or is life struggling to survive in the universe? And as you know, the Earth is not so nice to us. We have all these tsunamis, we have all the disasters, we had the plague that was killing people, etc. People have been struggling to survive. At the end of the 19th century, in Pomerania, the average life span was just 20 years. It is incredible. People were dying because of any kinds of infections, right? And if you know that when you sneeze, in English you say bless you. That's because that means you're going to be sick. Bye-bye, see God, right? So the universe is not so conducive to life as we know. There may be a supernova that will just blow up around the Earth, like 10 light years from the Earth, and the life will be gone. Right? This is very real danger that we have. Not just the meteorites, the comets, etc., but the life may end because of a supernova. That's something we have not been prepared by any holy books of that. Okay, so now the next point is, well, maybe mind and intelligence are something that we cannot explain. I think when I was actually a student, let me still go back to life. When I was doing my master thesis, my colleague was working with Professor Kwiatkowski, who is unfortunately deceased since a long time, who was a biophysicist. And his work was to review all theories, how life has emerged. There were about 20 theories, very hard to prove them because we don't know exactly the conditions that were around 4 billion years ago. But there are enough interesting ideas and theories to explain how that could have happened in the past. And now we know much better than we knew 30 years ago when I was doing my master thesis. Okay, so now maybe mind, intelligence, consciousness, and other things that we don't quite understand are something that we cannot explain by science and especially by evolution. But do we have a problem explaining why ants behave the way they do? Well, of course, there are lots of details. I mean, behavior of ants is still something that people investigate. Octopus is a wonderful intelligence that really can do quite a lot. Apes are quite smart. Well, but maybe people think humans are very special. And now, more and more we learned how non-special we are in many ways. And of course, well, when you think about the animals like dogs, they have little brain, and they think mostly about simple things. And we think about all kinds of things. Well, this is the philosopher. But now think about the Bushmen. How many great works of art they have made, or great works of books, etc. I mean, the Bushmen are just living a simple life, hunting and then mating, and that's the life they have, right? Now, we look at the very advanced human civilization and say, okay, this is something so advanced that it's hard to compare with the animals. But when we look at the Bushmen and look at the primates, for example, that have 10 times smaller cortex than we have. Now, how much could you really do if you had a small brain like this? Now, that's a question we can answer because there are people with very small brains. And we see that they're not philosophers. They can hardly maintain their own life. Without help, they're going to die. They have to be helped all the time, right? So although the primates have very small cortex that is specialized to perceive and act, and that helps them to survive in a complex environment, they have very small associative areas in particular, so they cannot invent too many things. But people have observed that they clearly have intentions. They can compose symbols as this one here, and show what they want. They can actually express certain simple sentences, maybe with 3 words, and they have better working memory than people. In experiments like this one, when you see 9 numbers in different places, and you ask people where they are, where the numbers are after exposure of a second or 2, people make lots of errors and are quite slow. But monkeys are very fast. Why is that? Because associative cortex is disturbing our perception. In case of monkeys, all they know, they really can focus completely on what they see. And then they can recreate that very quickly. And the DNA of chimps, as you know, is 99% like our DNA. So you see the unity of life very much. And the altruistic behavior, the sense of justice, lots of things that we thought are very human-like have been observed in many experiments nowadays. So investigating the apes is really something quite interesting. Unfortunately, the major books by Franz de Waal and other people have never been translated to Polish. Okay, so moving now to the point where I try to show you that many of the things can be understood if we look at what brains are doing. And that's what actually is my job nowadays. I used to be a physicist, I used to be a computer scientist, now I work with the infants. We try to understand the brain development and the brain processes. Our possibilities, the thoughts that come to our brains, are limited by genetic and neural determinism. You know that because of the genetic errors, people may have serious problems and may have all kinds of developmental problems, Down syndrome, but also they may die very early. Their brain may be very small, the microcephalia, for example, and they never develop their normal human potentials. But when you think about your own thinking, well, thoughts are coming to your mind. Can you call them? I don't know how. I mean, I have to wait, and then a thought pops up, and then another thought pops up, okay? But to think what I'm going to think, I'll have to think what I'm going to think, right? So there is this infinite regress that, well, shows that there is a spontaneous activity, thoughts are coming to our mind, and this is because we have the brains as we have. In the brain, you see all these pathways and all the connections. Once we look at the connections, the connectome is now very investigated, on all levels now, right? People try to look how things are connecting, how the brain states are related to our mental states. There is no simple causality. That is, what you hear changes your brain. But what you have now as a brain structure determines what comes up in your mind, right? So if you are brainwashed in childhood or brainwashed by some kind of organization, what will come up in your mind is going to be associations with what has been implanted in your brain. And you can't help it. You just think this way. So if I meet people who believe in all kinds of conspiracy theories, and we know that we have a good number of them in Poland now, I know they can help it. I mean, this is what comes to their minds because of associations. They hear about the birch and they see the plane crashing, right? Okay, you just can't help it. So there is no simple causality here. Things that happen to us change our brain, but our brains, the way they are, decide what pops up and how we behave. And this whole circle is very complex. Actually, in the antiquity in India, 2,500 years ago, they understood this. And they had this nice symbol that you can find in the eastern part of Poland on the tents of the Tatars who came to Poland from the east. And that came through India to Tibet, to Mongolia, and then to Europe. And this is the symbol which is called the infinite entanglement. And it shows there is this doctrine that everything is interdependent and that in space and time, everything is connected somehow. The reason you came here is because, well, there are many of you, and each of you had some reasons. And it's such a complex of different events. And the fact that you have brains the way you have, and the fact that you were around here in this place, etc., that you heard about the event, it's such a complex thing in space and time that brings us together to share some experiences. So this idea that there is no simple linear causality has been discovered a long time ago. And this makes certain things difficult. So why are we conscious of things? Well, one thing is that when you hear things and the stimuli are very weak, that's a kind of a ripples in the brain, but they never propagate. They die quickly because other stimuli are coming. Well, when you pay attention, but the stimuli is still very weak, you cannot really perceive that, although the ripples are bigger. Well, when you are busy with texting or writing things and somebody tells you something, you can miss it, right? Because you're too focused on other things. So again, even if the stimuli is strong, you shout at people and they're still doing something, it just doesn't reach them, right? You have to pay attention, which means your prefrontal cortex has to activate the brain areas that have to process the information coming in, and then the ripples will go through all the brain, and we slowly learn how to read this. We learn how to read this looking at where it happens, what time it happens, what was the frequency of the waves or oscillations, what was the energy, and we can recreate by looking at the brain activity. That's another thing that we do now. Looking on the brain activity, we can recreate what you mentally have in your mind. You can hear people, thoughts in a way by reconstructing the human auditory cortex activity. This is what has been done recently in this paper by Paisley. You can actually find out what they have seen by showing them many movies, and then they imagine things. And in the scanner, you see it very blurred. But you see the differences between this picture, this picture, this picture, and this picture. It's very blurred because you have a skull. You cannot really reach the neurons. If we will find the volunteers to put 1 billion electrodes in your brain, we're going to have a very sharp picture. But unfortunately, there are no volunteers who would like to have 1 billion electrodes, and this is technically not feasible yet. Okay, so the pictures are blurred, but we can see your mental images coming. And the same is about the hearing, but also the same is about your decisions. You think that you decide, but in simple experiments, you can look at the plans of the decisions. And I'm not aware yet of what will come up in my mind in 10 seconds' time. But the plans are forming, so my brain has to make some plans to make a reasonable sentence, right? I don't know what the sentence will be, but the brain has to plan it. And so in simple experiments that have been done in the past 5 years or so, people could look at prefrontal cortex and predict what will be the activity, whether I press things on the left or I press things on the right. Very simple things. But you can know it before the subject knows it. Because I think that I consciously made the decision. But somebody from outside may look at the neural activity of my brain and predict that before I know it. So again, this is nothing special about the acts, the decisions, the will. It's something that the brains do. And we're going to be quite certain that we understand it when we'll build the brains. There are several programs. You probably heard about the Human Brain Project. The Human Brain Project has been started in Europe last year, or this year actually, and got about 1 billion euro for 10 years to build something like artificial brain. There are other projects, like Synapse project in the US, that is now in the 3rd stage, that are going to build parts of it. And we're going to compare that with what brains are doing. And we're going to see the internal thoughts, deliberations that are going to arise in the system like that. Well, before we have it, we should not say that we understand. So, just to sum it up, people have tried to use all kinds of divine revelations to understand the world and science. And there has been a famous book by Andrew Dickinson White, again, never translated to Polish. And it's called The History of Warfare of Science and Theology in Christendom. It has been published in 1895. This fellow has been the first president of the American Historical Association and has been also the first president and the founder of Cornell University. Ezra Cornell just gave the money. And he wrote, "My conviction is that science will go hand in hand with religion, and in the love of God and our neighbor will steadily grow stronger and stronger." He has shown how people try to draw conclusions, not just in astronomy, but all kinds of things based on the Bible and the stories that we find, well, important for our culture somehow. Astronomy, anthropology, biology, economics, physics, hermeneutics, history, geography, geology, linguistics, medicine, meteorology, sociology, zoology, many other things. This is just 2 volumes detailing how people were wrong trying to draw conclusions from what they had in the Bible. And ancient philosophy almost always got everything wrong, but once we have it, and we are taught that in the childhood, this is the associations that we have. This is what is in our brain. So you should think, what can we gain trying to explain the world using God and faith? And there is a Gale Encyclopedia of Religion, 15 volumes, 1,100 pages. In Christianity alone, there is 40,000 denominations and 40 major divisions. Same text, different conclusions. Can we really conclude anything that we can believe in? And this is very tricky. So the question is, why people believe in Scientology? This has been an invention of a guy writing science fiction. Everybody knew he is a science fiction writer, and yet there is 1 million people believing in that, including famous actors, like Tom Cruise and other guys. Now, how they can be so naive? Okay, so another question is why people invented so many religions. Now, that's very clear, because they try to find simple answers. Once you have a simple answer, you don't need to question things. So it's kind of a laziness of the brain. I'm happy with the answer. I won't proceed with this. But imagine that we will be stuck with the answers that Copernicus had. We'll never discover lots of things in science, right? This will stop us from asking questions and thinking further. So I think it's very dangerous to rely on this type of thinking. And we have now a field called neurobiology of religion, or neurotheology sometimes. And that is, people try to find out why certain people stick with what they have been told in the childhood or later. What factors make you a believer? What factors don't allow you to be skeptical and to really question your beliefs? And we have lots of factors that contribute to it. One of them is the reward mechanism based on dopamine receptors. And this is related to several genes that people have discovered, and it's certainly much more complex than I'm able to tell you now, but we understand better and better why certain people believe what they were told and never change their mind. Okay, so be careful with the beliefs, because lots of people tell you that the day of judgment is coming, the end of the world. You know, in Torun we had this banner saying 21st of May. This came from Harold Camping, who is a preacher in the US, and Family Radio.com. They announced that everywhere in the world. They spent more than $100 million asking people to donate, and Americans especially try to buy their guns, buy canned food, dig the shelters, stay in the shelters, because the end of the world is coming. Okay, good luck. It's been coming for 2,000 years, as you know, and somehow we're still fine. So I have a nice list of of hundreds of dates predicted for all kinds of events like this. So, I mean, this year, if you look, there are also several are predicted. Don't worry about that. And also, in Poland, there is a group of parliament members, MPs, who actually try to, pass through the parliament a law that we have to crown Jesus Christ as the King of Poland, because otherwise Poland will be destroyed. This comes from the visions in the 30s of Celiakia Rozalkowna, who is a candidate to be a saint. And unfortunately, she had some kind of bad visions. Many people still believe in this. Okay. They can't help it, I think. That's how the brains work. So just to finish, Gandhi has saved my life and my wife's life one long time ago. So I really like his thoughts and his autobiography. You have to be careful what you believe in. Your beliefs become your thoughts become your words your actions your habits, and habits your values, and finally the values becomes your destiny. That's it, thank you.
I want to address you on this subject by first of all pointing out some things that philosophers and mathematicians and people not necessarily immediately in the area of Professor Duch have said. We need to be aware of some important issues here. Professor John Lennox, who's well known, lectures often on these subjects, he has said that the issue between the atheist and the believer is not whether it makes sense to question ultimate fact. And indeed, we've heard all sorts of interesting facts, which I don't doubt whatsoever what Professor Duch was saying. But the issue is, what fact is ultimate? The atheist's ultimate fact is just the universe. The theist's ultimate fact is God. And so the issue and the burning question is, in which direction does science point? My faith is not built on what I don't know. My faith is built on what I do know. That is the issue. I don't doubt that we may be able to build a brain or something like it, but it won't be human, because humanity isn't defined by brains. You see, the issue is it matter before mind or mind before matter? Now, of course, I'll develop this point about the mind in a moment. And indeed, Copernicus, of course, we're in the place of Copernicus here, and he said The universe was built for us by the best and most orderly workman of all. We need to get back to the faith of Copernicus. Now, Professor Duch, as I understand it, has his position in here. Ontology means how we understand things. He doesn't believe in no mind. I don't think that's his position. I've read quite a number of his writings. I think his position is in what we would call reductive physicalism. He believes that the mind reduces to basically matter and molecules and something that we can eventually, he thinks. I may have got him wrong, so forgive me if I have, Professor Duch, but I think this is essentially where you sit, that will eventually build a big enough computer to be able to simulate the physics of the mind, and then we will have created mind. That's certainly not my position. My position would be essentially as an interactive dualism. And if you know anything about consciousness and mind, it's not Platonism, but nevertheless it is a belief that mind and matter in the end are different. Professor Duch has written this: the quest for a better understanding of human nature has just started, and neuroscience is at its forefront. In the last few decades, cognitive neuroscience has made significant progress towards understanding the mind. Joseph Ledoux, an expert in the neuroscience of emotion, makes a statement: you are your synapses. Now, I'm not saying Professor Duch necessarily agrees with that last statement, but I don't think he's far away from it. He's basically reducing everything to synapses. Is this all we are? Or is there more? In this book, which I honour, the Bible, it says, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? And I think we need to have a humility. Not saying that Professor Duch doesn't have a humility, but I think our humility needs to recognise that the very things which have gone wrong in the universe have warped our very minds. And we need to be aware of that. I'm going to just say a few words about some basic science, then talk about rationality. That will be the main thing that I'll talk about. And then morality. Just a point of order here. I started at about 10:02, I think, so I finished at about 20 past. Okay, thank you. So I'll spend most of my time on the second part, and then I'll come to morality. So, some basic bioscience first. And what I want to just remind us all is that essentially we're made of cells, and the cells have nuclei, and in the nuclei we have a database which is made of nucleotides which are held together by sugar phosphate vertical bars, as it were, and the rungs going across, as you well know, those of you who do bioscience, actually are effectively a coding system. And that coding system is, to be frank, utterly remarkable. But even the physics of DNA cannot be made just by throwing into a petri dish all the raw building blocks of the chemistry of DNA and hoping that if we stir it for 5 billion years, we will eventually get DNA. We will not. The physics is all against it because the energy isn't there to do it. And what is more, the energy has to be guided in a very particular way in order to get the DNA to polymerize from the basic chemicals. In other words, it's not just enough just to have all the stardust, as was intimated earlier. You've actually got to have a very guided process in order to make DNA. This is thermodynamics, and I've written on this, and Professor Duch, I'm sure, is aware of the papers I've written on this very issue, and if you want the references, I can give you them later. The raw building blocks will not make DNA. There is actually an impossibility there for doing it. The only way you can do it is by actually using a very specific compound. I don't know whether it's shown on the screen, it's not. but you actually have got to have ATP, which is actually whirring around as a little motor, which adds high energy in a very specific way. And then once you've added that high energy in, then you actually have energized molecules, pre-molecules, which then become DNA. So the ATP is absolutely essential. That's just some basic bioscience, but also thermodynamics. And then the free energy change, those of you who do science, is negative, and it will become DNA. So the very mechanism for making DNA is a very, very specialized process, which involves ATP, which itself is a very unstable molecule. And to suggest, as some people have said, that you will eventually just be able to produce DNA, frankly, is missing the point. You cannot just shine lots of energy at a lot of molecules which you think will eventually combine. You need a very specific guided process. And we will eventually, I'm sure, be able to do it, but it will require a huge amount of intelligence. And you know that DNA has these letters that are referred to, the CAT and the CTT here in this diagram, and the GGA are standing for 4 nucleotides. The order of 3 of them actually determines what amino acid is eventually made from those triplets. And you well know that it involves single-stranded RNA, and it involves those single-stranded RNA going through the process of the ribosome making an amino acid. It's a very detailed process. But that is actually an information system. Now, just like cells have information systems, now let me come to the issue of rationality in the mind, because there's a lot of similarities between what's going on in the cell, which is really a microcosm of what's really happening at a somewhat larger level with the neural networks which our brains are. And of course, Professor Duch is recognized, and I give him all the tribute that he deserves here, a recognized expert in neural networks, which are a fast systemized information exchange system. But it's very similar in principle to the issues that I've just been discussing about DNA. You may understand all the workings of every single neuron in that system, but will you have really understood the mind which is actually using it? You're understanding a very complicated vehicle, but it's no different in principle to the issues that I was raising about the DNA. Because we haven't just got matter and energy, we've got information, which raises the issue, what is information? Information is essentially a coded message, and a code sits on material, but the code is not defined by the material. And a message, which I'm using now, uses a language. I'm using English. If I was able to learn your wonderful language, I might speak in Polish, but I'm afraid I can't. But the message is not defined by the English nor by the Polish. The message is something which transcends the language. So message is entirely consistent with mind being behind it. But of course, Professor Duch in his writings suggests that a non-material mind is simply an illusion, and that really all the mind is just really a very complicated set of neural networks, which is essentially the brain. And so playing on his name, he says, is it just a ghost, a Duch in your language, in a machine, as Duch maintains? And is that actually what is going on? I maintain no, he's missed the point. It isn't what's going on. What defines information, as I've already said, is that the code isn't the same as the matter and the energy. And Professor Werner Gitt has really the best writer in this area. And he has shown that really there are a whole set of levels of information exchange. I've just chosen 2. And here is a message which says in Morse code, John loves Mary. I'm sure Mary would have much appreciated the message on the right, rather than the Morse code on the left. Maybe she would have appreciated no words at all, and just simply a hug. You see, semantics and message means that the message is not the same as the code. Let's move on. It's very interesting that one of the greatest mathematicians, Polanyi, said this, referring to DNA, but the same point applies to neural networks, Professor Duch. Whatever may be the origin of a DNA configuration, or we could say here neural networks, it can function as a code only if its order is not due to the forces of potential energy. It must be as physically indeterminate as the sequence of words on a printed page. In other words, to have information at all, it mustn't be predictable from physics and chemistry. If it is, you've lost it. There's no such thing as information on a system which is entirely predetermined by physics and chemistry. It's a very important principle for that. So what defines the information in a neural network? We could go through all the details that I'm sure Professor Duch could lecture us for hours on the synapses itself, the neurons travelling through the synapses, the energy fired in the synapses, and so on and so forth. But really, in the end, the issue is this, that computer programming, or a description of what's going on there, doesn't come about by accident, and information implies an organising purpose, and an organising purpose implies intelligence, and intelligence is consistent, I would suggest, with a mind behind it. But is a non-material mind an illusion? Because that is what is being suggested to us tonight. That really, when you examine Professor Duch's writings, he is basically saying that the idea of a non-material duality is just an illusion. Now, I'm sure he's aware of Professor Robinson from Georgetown, who has really honed in on the real weakness of strict naturalism, which is what basically Professor Duch is following. And he wryly makes this statement. It is one of the quiet triumphs of the human mind that it can exhaust itself in attempting to refute its own existence. If you think about that, that's a very clever statement. Basically, people are trying to argue that our minds don't exist. I contend with that strongly. Professor Duch himself has said that, speaking of Aristotle, his concept of the soul became reified, that means solidified, and was used to answer the question, who am I, giving an illusion of understanding. But which view is more coherent concerning our understanding? Am I just a glorified machine? Or do I have a non-material mind? I'm not necessarily immediately talking about the soul, but obviously the two, I would suggest, are connected. But am I just a machine which, given a big enough computer, you could predict what I was going to say next? He also went on to say, we do not believe in a flat earth at the centre of the universe, although our direct experience favours such beliefs. I'm not sure actually that it does, but we'll give him that statement just for a moment. But by the same token, Professor Duch, neither do we believe that hardware creates software. In other words, we seem to be moving into a direction which really seems to be negating our very experience from simple observations. A computer doesn't write its own software. There is something missing in your logic. You have a famous paper or famous lecture where you try to argue against the Chinese room objection, where the Chinese room objection is basically saying that if you've got a big enough Turing machine, and if you had a person inside who was just simply going through an algorithm, changing the Chinese into the next bit that was meant to be spoken in Chinese, you could get the impression that the person doing that inside actually understood Chinese, when in fact he didn't understand it at all. And so you make the objection to Searle's comments, which is a very famous paper, this, where he says, Searle says at the bottom of the slide, syntactic relations are not sufficient for semantics. You make the statement back, it is not a test, the outcome is always negative, if I go into your head I won't understand either. But that misses the point, because Duch has not disproved Searle. He thinks he has. All that he's done is beg the question, which is, what is knowledge? How do I know that I know something? And he hasn't answered it. He may have the big enough computer. He may have €1 billion to do what he's going to do, but will he have understood the real logic of why somebody thinks what they do? Duch is trapped by his own materialist assumptions. Because if we change the assumptions, we get a very different answer. You see, what is buried in this is really Crick's beliefs. Crick was a well-known materialist. He discovered DNA in 1953, but he famously said, you, your joys, your sorrows, your memories and ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behaviour of a vast assembly of nerve cells, neurons, and their associated molecules. Okay? Is that all we are? That's what Crick thought. Crick has famously laid down this statement, and everybody else has just followed him. But he's coming at the science with his own worldview of atheistic materialism. And he's hidden it in his statements. Thomas Nagel is far more honest. And he's no Christian. He doesn't agree with my position. But he admits that materialistic naturalism, or we might say ontological materialism, basically saying that the only way we can understand everything is by just appealing to matter and energy, that leads to reductionist ambitions, because it seems unacceptable to deny the reality of all those familiar things that are not at first glance physical. Then he goes on to say, if denying reality to the mental continues to be unacceptable, and I suggest that it does, that suggests that the original premise, materialist naturalism, is false and not just around the edges. Now, he's not actually justifying a Christian position. Indeed, in his book, which I recommend that you read, Mind and Cosmos, he clearly says that I'm not going in the direction of the Christian faith. But he at least is being honest here. He says perhaps the natural order is not exclusively physical. And I think he's right. John Lennox, who is a Christian, he says if the concept of truth itself results from nothing more than the behaviour of a vast assembly of nerve cells, how in the name of logic would we know that our brain was composed of nerve cells? In other words, he's saying, how do I know that I know? It's epistemology, really, which is at the bottom of this. Darwin also said the same. With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, in his view, are of any value or at all trustworthy. How do I trust my own mind if, in fact, if I have a big enough computer, I can predict what Professor Duch is going to do next? Where's rationality gone? In fact, John Polkinghorne makes that very point. He says that this position destroys rationality. And he goes on to say, the very assertions of the reductionist himself are nothing but blits in the neural network of his brain. The world of rational discourse then dissolves into the absurd chatter of firing synapses. In other words, we've lost all hope of meaning. If my mental processes are determined solely by the motions of atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true. And hence I have no reason for supposing my brain to be composed of atoms. These are well-known statements from leading people who not all of whom are Christians. Haldane certainly wasn't a Christian, and he shows the weakness of a reductionist position, which is the position, as I understand it, of Professor Duch. There is a patent self-contradiction running through all attempts, however sophisticated they may appear, to derive rationality from irrationality. You can't do it. You just can't do it. If we adjust physics and chemistry, rationality has disappeared. What then is knowledge? That really is the issue. Duch has said this: the battle for a special status of the mind as non-physical entity has been entirely lost. That's his view. The mind seems to be in control, and yet we know that it is only an illusion. One reason why this illusion has been so dear to us is that it has been the basis for personal responsibility, in which case I've said nothing can be known scientifically. Why should I trust human reason if I'm only neurons? It's incoherent. It doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense of reason. You've lost reason. C.S. Lewis, who was probably the greatest English thinker, I would suggest, overall, of the 20th century, I'd put him, in terms of philosophy, on a level, certainly, with many of the others from England in that time. Nature is quite powerless to produce rational thought. Not that she never modifies our thinking, but that the moment she does so, it ceases to be rational. For as we have seen, a train of thought loses all rational credentials as soon as it can be shown to be the result of non-rational causes. So the issue is, what is knowledge? I come at it from a totally different angle. Knowledge is revealed. And the Bible clearly says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And I say that quite unashamedly. When you presuppose not know God, but presuppose God is there, you don't remove research in science. You actually open up a whole new area of science. Science is not closed down by Christianity. Science is unlocked by Christianity. The main proponents of the scientific position 400 or 500 years ago were Christians. The main proponents, not all, but the main proponents. And we need to realize that Christianity doesn't close down science. It is atheism which will close down all rationality if we let it go on. Now, I won't go into all the details of that logical conundrum there, but if you start, as the atheist does, with no God, freedom just to do as I think, then you have no foundation for truth. We're just molecules, we don't have a soul, we're just genes, we have no individuality, we have no free will, and eventually you end up with a contradiction because molecules can no longer talk about freedom. It's incoherent. And it's well known to be incoherent. You can't have it. Or to put it another way, the philosophy of naturalism undercuts its own basis of thought. Rationality is like the person sitting on the wrong side of the cut on a tree branch, and he cuts away the very place on which he's sitting. Naturalism undermines the basis of all naturalism. It ends up with just a cacophony of firing synapses without meaning. Let me come to my last point. Sorry, it was not. This has jumped to a place it shouldn't have jumped to. Let me now come to this last point, which is morality. Sorry. Here's some people admiring modern art. Insightful. Compelling. Exemplary. The cleaner comes in. Upside down. You see, you can't make sense of anything. Meaning has been lost, and meaning will always be lost in what is essentially a postmodern view of science, which is what Duch has really been saying is the way forward. I don't believe a postmodernist view of science will get us anywhere. It will actually lead to an encouragement of a meaninglessness in a meaningless world. It will just become noise. Jerry Coyne has said quite rightly, and I agree with him, that in the evolutionary position, evolution says you're not created by God, that you have no special purpose, and there is no morality, absolutely. That's convenient, because it then means that I can do as I want, can't I? And William Provine, whom I've debated also, said this: no life after death, no ultimate foundation for ethics, no meaning for life, no free will. No inherent moral or ethical laws exist. Jack Monod, who was no Christian, said this, that actually, if it is true that there is no purpose in the universe, that man is a pure accident, you cannot derive any ought from is. And basically, I'm ending with this point here, that if Jack Monod, if we take his logical thinking to its conclusion, he was a person who was saying that there is no meaning, that there is no Christian position, there's no position of ethics, but he understood the logical inference from what he was saying. That we then have to accept that the universe is indifferent to man's hopes and is indifferent to his suffering and is indifferent to his crimes, which means that there is no basis for any ethics whatsoever. So we end up with this position. Not only do we have no coherence for morality, but we have no rational foundation for right and wrong, and that is a very, very serious position to take a person to. So I would like to end by saying this: if we have no coherence, both for rationality and no coherence for right and wrong, if our brains are just material substrates on which the mind functions, yes, I agree with that. But if in fact we are only that, then we've lost any basis for who we are and any responsibility. The Bible says, of course, that we are made in the image of God himself. And when we actually analyse the two positions, what I would suggest we end up with is that the materialism that Professor Duch has been outlining ends up with no explanation for the machinery in life, no explanation for rationality, no explanation for moral responsibility. Why would it be wrong for me to kill the granddaughter of Professor Duch, if he has one, or a daughter or a son?
I have two.
There you go. Why would it be wrong for him to kill one of my grandchildren, whom I love dearly? There's got to be an absolute foundation for ethics. The Bible, of course, has it. We need to get back to Copernicus, who spoke about the godlike work of the best and greatest artist, and he was referring to the God who had made the universe. We need to get back to a Christian position. Thank you.